June 6, 1944, was one of those days when the course of human history could have changed forever. At dawn, the beaches of Normandy saw more than 160,000 Allied soldiers cross the English Channel from England to France. Their objective, to open a second front against the Nazis in Europe. If all went well, victory over Hitler and his forces would draw closer. But if they failed, the future of Europe and the wider world would hang by a thread. The Allies knew it. That's why they launched the largest amphibious and airborne invasion in military history, in an operation codenamed Overlord. Since 1941, Joseph Stalin had been pressing the Allies to open a second front against the Nazis in Western Europe. However, it wasn't until 1943, at the Trident Conference in Washington, D.C., that Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to carry out the invasion. A year later, the map of the war looked like a jigsaw puzzle. In the east, the Soviet Union had halted the Wehrmacht, but the human cost of victory was immense. In the Mediterranean, after Allied success in North Africa, the campaign in Italy was grinding forward. And every night, hundreds of bombs fell on Germany, damaging factories, transportation, and civilian morale. But no aircraft could occupy a city. Retaking the cities captured by the Nazis was essential to winning the war. By then, Allied leaders saw the invasion as necessary for both military and political reasons. The Soviets insisted that without a landing in the West, the war would drag on too long and the post-war map would look different. For their part, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on the need for an offensive that would put Allied armies back on the continent, cut German supply lines, and return to whole peoples the chance to be liberated. The strategic name for this grand campaign was Overlord, and to lead it, U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Meanwhile, British General Bernard Montgomery took command of the 21st Army Group, which gathered all the ground forces that would take part in the invasion. The first phase would be an amphibious landing and the creation of a secure beachhead, a position from which Allied troops would push into the European interior. This mission was codenamed Operation Neptune. Before the invasion began, the Allies launched a bombing campaign to destroy German aircraft production, cut their fuel supply, and isolate northern France. The bombing was dispersed so as not to reveal the landing sites. In addition, deception maneuvers were planned to keep the Nazis from discovering the place and date of the offensive. The Allies staged a hall of mirrors called Operation Fortitude. They created phantom divisions with inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft that fooled aerial photography, antennas that spoke to no one but looked very busy, and radios that broadcast plausible chatter. The goal was to convince the German command that the main blow would fall at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The Allies also conjured a fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly quartered in Kent and Sussex, and commanded by General George Patton. At the same time, a network of double agents fed German intelligence false information. The Catalan spy Joan Pujol sent hundreds of messages prepared by British intelligence to persuade the German High Command that the attack would take place at Calais in July. Eisenhower, however, had selected June 5th as the date of the assault. On the 4th, weather conditions were far from ideal. The Luftwaffe's meteorological center in Paris predicted 2 weeks of stormy weather. So many Wehrmacht commanders left their posts to attend military maneuvers in Rennes, and numerous soldiers were granted leave. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and meet with Hitler in person. But the Allies dominated the Atlantic and could make better forecasts, and their meteorological team, headed by Royal Air Force Captain James Stagg, predicted the weather would improve enough to launch the invasion on the 6th. Before the battle, Eisenhower wrote a letter to the Allied troops to motivate them. "You are about to embark upon the great crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world." Before midnight, around 1,200 aircraft, led by Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, took off from England to carry 24,000 soldiers, organized into 3 divisions, to their drop zones behind enemy lines. At the same time, at sea, Operation Neptune assembled the largest armada in naval history. A total of 6,939 vessels sailed from Southampton, Plymouth, Weymouth and Portsmouth toward the coast of Normandy, transporting more than 130,000 men. In overall command was Sir Bertram Ramsay, who divided the fleet in two. The Western Naval Force, under Admiral Alan G. Kirk, was to support the U.S. First Army, which would attack Omaha and Utah beaches. The Eastern Naval Force, led by Sir Philip Vian, would support the Anglo-Canadian Second Army. These latter forces were to attack Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. D-Day had begun. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., 18 ships and a group of Lancaster bombers approached Cap d'Antifer to release window chaff and operate radio and radar equipment 10 kilometers off the French coast. Meanwhile, another group of 12 vessels and short Sterling bombers carried out the same actions near the Pas de Calais. They aimed to distract the German defenses. At 5:45 a.m., 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors began bombarding the French coast for 40 minutes. At 6:30 a.m., the main assaults began. Utah Beach was defended by the German 709th Infantry Division, which had installed 7 fortified strongpoints and 20 batteries. 2 artillery batteries at Montebourg and Saint-Marcouf could fire on this beach, with a range of about 30 kilometers. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former U.S. president, landed in the first assault wave and realized that, due to strong currents, the headquarters staff of the 4th Infantry Division had touched down 2 kilometers south of the planned point. 2 squadrons of duplex drive tanks, designed to float, were launched 3 kilometers offshore. These vehicles were fitted with 2 propellers and a special canvas screen that kept water out of the machinery. The tanks approached the beach in 2 assault waves, the first with 12 tanks and the second with 16. German soldiers, regrouping after the bombardment, discovered the enemy tanks already heading for the shore, but the amphibious armored vehicles lagged behind and were soon overtaken by the landing craft of the 2nd Battalion, which led the attack in the Uncle Red sector of Utah Beach. At 6:35 a.m., the first assault wave reached Omaha Beach. The landing craft carried 1,450 soldiers who had to cover roughly 400 meters over open sand before finding even minimal cover. But at Omaha, the bombardment had not been effective, and the Germans were ready to defend their positions. As soon as the landing craft touched the sand, a hail of bullets fell on the American soldiers. The slaughter was immense. In just 5 minutes, 90% of the troops in the first assault wave were put out of action, including all the officers. The troops received almost no support from tanks. 29 DD amphibious tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion did not survive the heavy surf and sank. Only 58 made it to shore. 10 minutes later at Utah, the 1st Battalion was landing in the Tear Green sector at the same time as the amphibious tanks. Those tanks reached the beach and immediately went into action. German defenses raked the area with intense fire, but were soon silenced by U.S. artillery, and the beach fell under American control. But Omaha was hell. By 7 a.m., 14 of the 58 tanks had already been destroyed or abandoned. The others were trapped on the beach by the anti-tank wall or skidding on the shingle. The lack of firepower meant the infantrymen could not assault the German defensive positions. In addition, 270 sappers had been tasked with opening 16 lanes through the beach obstacles. But 27 minutes after the landings at Omaha, only 1 lane had been opened, and most of the sappers had been cut down by gunfire. At the same time, a group of Rangers arrived at Pointe du Hoc. There, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had been given one of D-Day's most daring tasks: scale the cliffs under fire to neutralize a battery of 155mm guns that could punish both beaches. But at 7:11 a.m., the Allies believed the operation had failed. The 500 Rangers who were to support the action at Pointe du Hoc were redirected straight to Omaha Beach. The current and waves flipped one of the Allied boats. Only 1 crewman survived. The others drowned under the weight of their gear. Decimated and without reinforcements, the Rangers who landed at Pointe du Hoc were met by German machine gun fire. The first men ashore fell, but the rest of the Rangers pressed the attack, using special rifles to fire grapnels and ropes. Some decided to climb the cliff by hand, using their knives for purchase, but the Germans began hurling grenades and spraying them with machine gun fire. The Rangers fell one by one under German fire, but they finally reached the top, using firefighters' ladders mounted on the landing craft and some ropes that the Germans couldn't cut. 15 minutes later, the Allies had taken Pointe du Hoc, but the guns weren't there. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder quickly organized the defense of the ground they held and radioed his headquarters to report the mission's success, the heavy casualties they had suffered, and the urgent need for reinforcements. The reply made his blood run cold. "Good work. Sorry about the reinforcements. They've already landed at Omaha." The Americans weren't the only ones facing the Germans. At 7:25 a.m., British troops came ashore on Gold Beach. The British launched a first assault wave with funnies, tanks designed for any task, to support the infantry's landing as quickly as possible. But when the troops reached the shore, they were met by fire from the German 716th Infantry Division, armed with 500 machine guns, 50 mortars, and 90 guns of various calibers. The British then began bombarding the German battery on the tip of the headland. They quickly took or destroyed the German batteries. Then the battalions of the 50th Infantry Division moved slowly toward the village of La Rivière. At Sword Beach, the situation was no different from the other landings. At 7:35 a.m., 25 funnies were tasked with making the first charge against the Germans. But German fire was intense, and bomb blasts burst all around the attackers, wounding and killing many. Even so, the funnies did their job, knocking out some German emplacements before the infantry reached the beach. However, the British advance at Sword was slow due to the Atlantic Wall defences and German fire. It was then that the Scottish nobleman and Brigadier Simon Fraser ordered Piper Bill Millin to play the tune "Let's Play Highland Laddie." When Millin objected, citing British regulations, Lord Lovat replied, but those are the English War Office's rules. You and I are Scots, and they don't apply." When the notes rang out over the beach, the German soldiers stopped firing for a few moments, stunned by the unexpected spectacle. According to Maurice Chauvet of the 1st Battalion of Marine Fusiliers of the Free French Forces, suddenly, when Millin started to play, the Germans stopped shooting for a few seconds. I couldn't believe what their eyes were seeing, or what their ears were hearing. However, on Juno Beach, the music was the chatter of machine guns. The rocks off Juno formed a series of reefs extremely dangerous for navigation. On top of that, bad weather delayed the landings by half an hour. This allowed the Germans to regroup and better prepare their defensive line. And when the landing craft came within good range, the Nazis opened up with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns. The Canadians thus faced a terrible Atlantic wall, much like the Americans were encountering at Omaha. Of the 306 landing craft, 90 were destroyed before reaching Norman Sand. The 7th and 8th Brigades suffered heavy casualties and serious delays, as the infantrymen hit the beach before the tanks and had to provide support under intense fire. The invaders also faced anti-tank walls more than 2 meters high that blocked the routes inland and masked German batteries and concentrations. Tank support was therefore essential if the Canadians were to overcome the Germans. So the landing craft tanks moved in as close as possible to reduce losses. Only the arrival of the tanks made it possible to knock out the German defenses one by one, and in this way, the infantry managed to advance on Juno Beach. The invasion was going well at Utah. The engineers had opened safe lanes that facilitated the landings, and at 8 a.m., an hour and a half after H-hour, the 5th assault wave touched down. There was, however, a hitch. Because they had landed in the wrong place, only a single road led inland from that part of the beach. 30,000 American soldiers and another 3,500 who still had to land and push into French territory seemed too many for such a narrow route. But despite the risk of congestion, Major General Barton decided to head inland along the only road he had. Meanwhile, the engineers managed to breach the anti-tank walls, allowing the troops to get off the beach and move on into Normandy. 2 hours after H-hour, the tanks crossed the dune and rolled inland. Utah had been a success. But at Omaha, the situation was dire. The troops that had landed were using the anti-tank walls as cover, walls that in some places stretched as long as 185 meters. These walls were high enough that a crouching soldier couldn't be seen by the Germans from their defensive positions. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the eastern end of the beach had to stay prone to avoid becoming targets for German fire. Even so, the German shells falling on this area caused many deaths. Omaha's sands began to fill with the bodies of soldiers torn apart by bullets and bombs. As the hours passed, the tide began to rise, and many wounded men drowned before they could be rescued. The survivors of the first 5 waves were trying to stay alive in the middle of that hell, dodging German snipers. The latter concentrated on picking off officers and any soldiers who took command in their place. Mortars focused their fire on vehicles that managed to reach the shore. Any American movement seemed impossible. On the beach, the few vehicles that hadn't been destroyed were unable to maneuver amid the terrible chaos. Dead and wounded everywhere, burning vehicles, helmets, weapons, ammunition, clothing, and abandoned equipment created the impression of complete disaster. Headquarters officers were alarmed. Defeat loomed at Omaha. Major General Clarence Hubner, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, asked the naval artillery to support the infantrymen. Some ships closed to within about 800 meters of the beach and began pounding enemy fortifications with their guns. By 9:30 a.m., the situation began to improve at Omaha, mainly on the eastern side of the beach around the Fox sector, where the fire was less intense. A group of soldiers then moved east toward Port-au-Bessin to try to engage German forces. Half an hour later, some of the men of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions of the 16th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division tried to punch a hole to get off the beach and head inland. They gathered to form a unit of about 200 men, a small miracle. Screened by the thick smoke from burning grassland and helped by their gas masks, the American soldiers inched forward. General Bradley watched the landings unfold through binoculars from the cruiser USS Augusta. The Navy's report was disastrous. At one point, Bradley considered halting the reinforcement waves to divert them to Utah, where the reports were much better. But in the end, he understood that the only way to take Omaha was to keep sending reinforcements. Sooner or later, the Germans would run out of steam. That is exactly what Bradley had foreseen. While the Americans kept landing men and ammunition, German supplies began to dwindle, and no reinforcements arrived. Nazi reinforcements never came because Third Reich generals lacked accurate information about the situation and saw no need to send large numbers of units to the beach immediately. The key panzer divisions were in reserve, and their deployment required authorization from the highest levels. That morning, the clock worked against the Reich. Hitler was asleep when the first reports arrived, and the process of releasing reserves was delayed. What's more, the weather had convinced Rommel there would be no landing. He wasn't even in Normandy. When the reserves finally began to move, they ran into skies dominated by Allied air power and terrain sabotaged by paratroopers, bridges blown, roads cut, whole columns forced into bottlenecks where fighter bombers were waiting. The 21st Panzer Division counterattacked near Sword and for a moment reached the coast, but naval gunfire and pressure on its flanks forced it to pull back. Around 11 a.m., the Germans could no longer hold the line, and gaps began to open. At the same hour on Gold Beach, the sappers had already opened most of the planned breaches in the defensive lines and the routes inland. This allowed a rapid landing and let British troops advance toward Port-au-Bessin, 12 kilometers from the beach. Meanwhile, the Americans at Omaha had taken the German positions commanding the beach one by one. The massacre at Omaha subsided, and vehicles and the rest of the troops continued to land. At the same time, at Sword Beach, the advance south began to accelerate. In this sector, the Germans were fairly disorganized and offered much weaker resistance than on the other beaches, so the French and British who landed at Sword were able to push south toward Ouistreham and took the town, though a German strongpoint there held out for another 3 days. As planned, Lord Lovat linked up with the paratroopers of the 6th Airborne at the Pegasus and Horsa bridges near Bénouville and Ranville, respectively. The BBC announced, "This is D-Day." Anne Frank wrote in her diary, "Is this the beginning of liberation? Where there's hope, there's life." By 4 p.m., Omaha was under control, although German sniper fire continued. An hour later, several groups of U.S. soldiers, particularly from the 115th and 116th Regiments of the 1st Infantry Division, reached the road connecting Vierville-sur-Mer, Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and Colleville-sur-Mer. The beachhead at day's end measured about 9 kilometers long and 3 kilometers deep. As night fell on June 6th, the word success didn't sound like a fanfare so much as a duty fulfilled, with asterisks. 5 beachheads had been established, but communication between them was shaky. Utah was pushing confidently inland, supported by the paratroopers' actions. Omaha was holding after brushing disaster. Meanwhile, Gold, Juno, and Sword held vital ground, though taking Caen remained an unmet objective, and the Rangers were withstanding German counterattacks at Pointe du Hoc. The human ledger was harsh: exhaustion, casualties, stories of bravery and fear, medics working without rest, engineers cutting exits for vehicles, sappers hunting mines. At sea, the galleys were firing up again. On land, the shovels never stopped. The day had achieved the essential: a firm foothold in France. But it was a fragile victory. The Allies had won the sand. The fields remained to be taken. And the question hanging over Normandy's hedgerows was simple and brutal. Could they fight their way through the bocage and withstand the armored counterattacks that would arrive at dawn?